The bitter December wind howled through the narrow streets of downtown, cutting through Marcus Thompson's threadbare jacket like it wasn't even there. He pulled the worn fabric tighter around his shoulders, though he knew it was a futile gesture. After 3 years on the streets, he'd learned that nothing really kept out the winter chill, especially not on New Year's Eve when the temperature seemed determined to break records. From his spot in the recessed doorway of what used to be Miller's bookshop, Marcus watched the festivities unfold around him. The street sparkled with holiday decorations, and cheerful couples hurried past, their arms laden with shopping bags and party supplies. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just across the street, the window display of Preston's Fine Dining advertised their New Year's Eve special, a $200 per person celebration complete with champagne and caviar. That amount would have kept him fed for weeks. At 45, Marcus hardly recognized himself anymore. The successful IT professional he'd been just 4 years ago seemed like a character from someone else's story. Back then, he'd had it all: a corner office, a comfortable suburban home, and a family who loved him. But life had a way of dealing unexpected cards. First came the company's downsizing, then his mother's cancer diagnosis that drained their savings, and finally, the depression that drove away his wife and teenage daughter. The dominoes had fallen so quickly, he barely had time to process one loss before the next hit. Tonight felt different though. Maybe it was the holiday spirit in the air, or perhaps it was the small act of kindness he'd experienced earlier. A young girl, no more than 7, had handed him her hot chocolate, complete with mini marshmallows, while her mother wasn't looking. The warmth of that simple gesture had stayed with him longer than the beverage itself. As the evening crowds grew thicker, Marcus noticed something unusual. A well-dressed elderly man had been pacing back and forth near the restaurant for the past 20 minutes, occasionally checking his phone with increasing agitation. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the man's hands shaking, and not from the cold. Years of working in crisis management had taught Marcus to recognize the signs of someone in distress. He debated with himself. The last time he tried to help someone, he'd been chased away and called names he'd rather forget. The world wasn't always kind to those who lived on the streets, even when their intentions were pure. But something about this situation nagged at him. The man's distress seemed to be escalating, and the holiday crowds, absorbed in their own celebrations, swept past him without a second glance. Marcus stood up slowly, his joints stiff from the cold and from sitting too long on the hard concrete. He didn't have much to offer anymore: no phone, no money, no resources. But he still had his voice, his experience, and most importantly, his humanity. Sometimes, he reminded himself, that was enough. What he didn't know, as he took those first hesitant steps toward the elderly man, was that this moment would become the catalyst for a chain of events that would transform not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. On this New Year's Eve, as the city prepared to bid farewell to another year, the universe was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most profound miracles begin with the smallest acts of courage. As Marcus approached the elderly man, his heart pounded against his ribs. The closer he got, the more details emerged: an expensive wool coat with a subtle pinstripe, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine, and a gold wedding band that caught the light from the street lamps. The man's distinguished appearance made Marcus even more conscious of his own shabby state. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, his voice raspier than he remembered. "Are you all right?" The elderly man startled, then took an instinctive step backward. Marcus was familiar with that reaction, the automatic recoil when someone who lived on the streets dared to initiate contact. But instead of dismissing him, the man's face crumpled. "My wife," he choked out. "She's inside the restaurant, but I can't go in there." His hands trembled as he gestured toward Preston's. 50 years we've been married. 50 New Year's Eves together, and now I can't even." Marcus noticed the man's breath coming in short gasps. Having suffered panic attacks himself during his darkest days, he recognized the signs. "Sir, try to breathe with me. Nice and slow." He demonstrated, keeping his distance but maintaining eye contact. "I'm Marcus. What's your name?" "Richard. Richard Kensington." The man struggled to match Marcus's breathing pattern. "I owned Kensington Manufacturing. Built it from nothing." His laugh was bitter. "Now I can't even walk into a restaurant to meet my wife for our anniversary dinner." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Kensington Manufacturing, the company that had acquired his former employer just before the mass layoffs. The very events that had started his downward spiral had likely helped build Richard's fortune. The irony of their current situation wasn't lost on him. For a moment, Marcus considered walking away. Let the rich man deal with his own problems. But the genuine distress in Richard's eyes stopped him. Pain was pain, regardless of the bank balance behind it. "What changed?" Marcus asked quietly. "Why tonight?" "Heart attack. 3 months ago." Richard's words came easier now, though his hands still shook. "The doctors saved me, but the anxiety. I can barely leave my house now. Eleanor, my wife, she's been so patient. But I promised her Prestons for our anniversary. It's our tradition." His eyes darted to the restaurant's entrance. "Now I'm standing out here like a coward while she waits alone." Marcus felt an odd sense of déjà vu. How many times had he stood frozen outside his own home after losing his job, unable to face his family with his failure? How many important moments had he missed because anxiety and depression had wrapped their chains around him? "Mr. Kensington," Marcus said, straightening his shoulders despite his ragged appearance, "would you allow me to help? I used to manage crisis situations in my previous life. Before." He gestured vaguely at himself, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel shame at his circumstances. Sometimes it's easier to face our fears with a stranger than with those we love most. Richard studied him with red-rimmed eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Someone helped me today," Marcus replied, thinking of the little girl with the hot chocolate. Kindness deserves kindness. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as an unusual sight, a homeless man and a business tycoon, walking together toward Preston's fine dining, one step at a time. Marcus talked Richard through breathing exercises he'd learned in therapy, sharing his own experiences with panic attacks. With each step, Richard's breathing steadied, though his grip on Marcus's arm remained tight. At the restaurant's entrance, they encountered their first obstacle. The maitre d' took one look at Marcus and moved to block their path, his face a mask of professional disdain. "Sir, I'm afraid we have a strict dress code." "He's with me," Richard interrupted, his voice finding some of its former authority. "This man is my guest." The maitre d' hesitated, clearly torn between the restaurant's policies and the commands of what was obviously a wealthy patron. But before he could respond, an elegant woman approached from inside. "Richard? Darling, is everything all right? I was getting worried." Eleanor Kensington was a striking woman with silver hair swept into a classic updo, her concerned expression deepening the fine lines around her eyes. Her gaze moved from her husband to Marcus, then back again, taking in the situation with remarkable perception. "Eleanor," Richard's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I couldn't. This gentleman, Marcus, he helped me." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes, followed by a flash of pain and then fierce determination. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and took both men's arms. "Then Marcus must join us for dinner. Any friend of my husband's is welcome at our table." The maitre d's face went through an impressive array of expressions before settling on resigned acceptance. As he led them to the Kensington's private booth, Marcus became acutely aware of the stares from other diners. His clothes, his unwashed state, his very presence seemed to offend the restaurant's refined atmosphere. But as they settled into the booth, Richard and Eleanor on one side, Marcus on the other, something extraordinary began to unfold. Eleanor ordered champagne for the table, treating Marcus with the same gracious respect she showed her husband. Richard, still shaken but visibly relieved to have made it inside, began asking Marcus questions about his background in IT. When Marcus mentioned the company he'd worked for, Richard's face paled. That acquisition. I never knew. My board handled most of the details. He fell silent, studying Marcus with new eyes. Sometimes our actions have consequences we never see. As their appetizers arrived, Marcus trying to remember which fork to use while Eleanor kindly guided him, he realized that this evening was about more than just helping a stranger through a panic attack. It was about the invisible threads that connected their lives, the ripple effects of both tragedy and kindness, and the possibility that even on the darkest nights, hope could appear in the most unexpected forms. What none of them knew yet was that this dinner would become more than just a chance encounter. The conversation flowing between them would plant seeds of change that would grow into something none of them could have anticipated. But for now, as the evening deepened and the year's end approached, they were just three people sharing a meal, each carrying their own burdens, each finding unexpected solace in the company of strangers who might become something more. The revelation came between the main course and dessert, as unexpectedly as everything else that evening. Eleanor had excused herself to the ladies' room, leaving Marcus and Richard in a moment of awkward silence. Richard absently twisted his napkin, then cleared his throat. I've been trying to figure out why your name seemed familiar, he said, pulling out his phone. It wasn't just from the acquisition records. His fingers moved across the screen with purpose. Here. Look at this. Marcus leaned forward, squinting at the image. It was an old email, dated nearly 15 years ago. His own name was in the sender field. The subject line read, Emergency Protocol Implementation, Server Room Fire Prevention. The memory hit him like a thunderbolt. Early in his career, he'd identified a critical flaw in a client's server room setup, a client that, he now realized, had been a subsidiary of Kensington Manufacturing. His recommended safety protocols had prevented what could have been a catastrophic fire. The client had sent a generous bonus, but he'd never known how far up the corporate ladder his report had traveled. That protocol you designed saved one of our most important facilities 6 months later, Richard said quietly. Prevented millions in damage. I always meant to meet the IT specialist who wrote it, but... He spread his hands in a helpless gesture. You get busy. Life moves on. You forget that behind every report, every email, there's a real person. Marcus sat back, stunned. The world had a strange way of connecting dots across time. I never knew, he managed. No, you wouldn't have. Richard's expression darkened. Just like you never knew that when my board pushed through that acquisition, they were planning the layoffs from the start. I was already stepping back then. Heart problems, though not as bad as now. I let them handle things. Trusted them to be ethical. His laugh was hollow. I should have paid more attention. Before Marcus could respond, Eleanor returned, but she wasn't alone. Following her was a young woman in her early 30s, wearing a server's uniform but carrying herself with the authority of management. Marcus's heart stopped when he saw her face. Dad? Sarah Thompson stood there, her name tag identifying her as the restaurant's assistant manager, staring at Marcus with a mixture of shock, pain, and something else, something that might have been hope. Sarah, he whispered. His daughter. His little girl who wasn't so little anymore. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been a teenager, watching with hurt eyes as he walked away, too consumed by his depression to stay. The restaurant seemed to fade away. Marcus could feel Richard and Eleanor's startled gazes moving between them, could sense other diners beginning to notice the scene unfolding, but none of it mattered. His daughter was standing there, and he had no idea what to say. Sarah spoke first, her voice professional but trembling slightly. I saw you come in earlier. I've been trying to. I wasn't sure if I should. She took a deep breath. I've been looking for you. For 2 years now. Mom too. Marcus felt the world tilt. Looking for me? After we got back on our feet, after Mom's new job. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. We hired a private investigator, but you never stayed in one place long enough. We've been putting messages out through the shelter networks, but... She gestured helplessly. You never registered at any of them. Pride. It had always been his downfall. Even homeless, he'd been too proud to seek help, too ashamed to use the systems designed to assist people like him. How many chances at reconnection had he missed because of it? Richard suddenly stood, swaying slightly. Sarah, is it? Please, join us. Eleanor and I were just about to order dessert. There's plenty of room. He looked at Marcus. That is, if your father doesn't object. The formality of the situation, his daughter in professional attire, him in his ragged clothes, the Kensingtons watching with careful politeness, struck Marcus as absurdly funny. He began to laugh, and after a moment, Sarah joined in, the sound breaking years of tension. I'll need to tell the kitchen I'm taking my break, she said, wiping her eyes. And Dad? Mom works just 3 blocks from here now. At the medical center. I could call her. Marcus felt terror and hope war in his chest. Catherine. His wife. The woman he'd left behind when the darkness became too much. Would she want to see me? Like this? Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. My dear, speaking as someone who has loved a proud man through his darkest times, she glanced meaningfully at Richard. Sometimes we need to let go of how we think we should appear and simply be present for the miracle that's being offered. As Sarah hurried off to make arrangements, Marcus looked around the table, at Richard, who had unknowingly been connected to both the rise and fall of his career, at Eleanor, whose gracious acceptance had made this moment possible, at the empty seat where his daughter would return. The twist of fate that had brought him to this restaurant tonight, all because he'd chosen to help a stranger in distress, seemed almost too perfect to be real. But there was one more surprise waiting in the elegant leather folder the maitre d' discreetly delivered to their table. Richard opened it, studied the contents, then slowly pushed it toward Marcus. I've been looking to rebuild our IT department, he said carefully. After my heart attack, I realized I needed to take a more active role in the company again. Make some changes. But I need people I can trust. People who understand both the technical and human sides of business. He paused meaningfully. The position comes with immediate health benefits and a housing allowance. Marcus stared at the folder, unable to speak. Through his tears, he could make out the Kensington manufacturing letterhead and the beginning of a job offer that would change everything. As the restaurant's clock began to strike midnight, marking the start of a new year, he realized that sometimes rock bottom was just the foundation for building something extraordinary. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of phone calls and preparations. Sarah had reached Catherine, Marcus's wife, at the medical center where she was working the New Year's Eve shift. She was coming. After 4 years of separation, Marcus would face the woman he'd walked away from when depression had convinced him he was doing her a favor. Dad? Sarah touched his shoulder gently. Mom's on her way. But there's something you should know. She hesitated. She remarried last year. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Of course she had. He'd disappeared, left her to rebuild their lives alone. What had he expected? The job offer in front of him suddenly seemed like a cruel joke. How could he rebuild a life that others had already rebuilt without him? Richard, sensing Marcus's distress, leaned forward. You don't have to stay. We can arrange to meet another time, discuss the position when you're ready. But Eleanor's hand caught Marcus's arm as he started to rise. Running once cost you everything, she said quietly. Don't let it cost you a second chance too. Before Marcus could respond, a commotion at the restaurant's entrance drew everyone's attention. Catherine stood there, still in her nurse's scrubs, her dark hair streaked with gray she hadn't had 4 years ago. Next to her was a tall man Marcus didn't recognize, her new husband, he presumed, and behind them, the maitre d' was unsuccessfully trying to explain the dress code. Marcus stood on shaky legs. The restaurant had gone quiet, the other diners watching the scene unfold. He took one step toward the entrance, then another, each movement feeling like he was walking through deep water. Catherine saw him and stopped mid-stride. "Marcus?" Her voice carried across the silent restaurant, filled with 4 years of questions. "I'm sorry," he said, the words he should have said years ago finally breaking free. "I'm so sorry, Kat." She crossed the remaining distance between them in quick steps, and Marcus braced himself, for a slap, for accusations, for the anger he deserved. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. "You stupid, stubborn man," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you let us help you?" The man who had entered with Catherine approached them slowly. Up close, Marcus recognized the hospital ID clipped to his scrubs. He wasn't Catherine's husband, he was her colleague. "Dr. Roberts here runs the hospital's mental health department," Catherine explained, still holding Marcus tightly. "He's been helping me coordinate with homeless outreach programs, trying to find you." She pulled back to look at him. "I never remarried, Marcus. I couldn't. Not when I knew you were out there somewhere, fighting your battles alone." Sarah had made her way to them, and suddenly Marcus found himself at the center of a family embrace he'd convinced himself he'd never feel again. The other diners had begun to applaud, led by Eleanor's elegant hands, but Marcus barely heard them. "But I left you," he managed to say. "I lost everything, became nothing." "You lost your job," Catherine corrected him firmly. "You lost your confidence. You let depression tell you lies about your worth. But you never lost us, we lost you." She glanced at Sarah. "Tell him." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him a Facebook page titled, "Finding Marcus Thompson." The page was filled with posts, updates, and shares across multiple homeless support networks. "We never stopped looking, Dad. Every time someone thought they'd spotted you, we'd follow up. But you moved around so much." Dr. Roberts stepped forward. "Your family has been instrumental in helping us improve our outreach programs, Mr. Thompson. Their search for you has helped us connect other families with their missing loved ones. Sometimes loss creates ripples of healing we never expect." Marcus looked back at the Kensington's table, where Richard and Eleanor watched with tearful smiles. The job offer still lay there, but it no longer seemed like the most important piece of paper in the world. His family had never given up on him. They'd turned their pain into purpose, helping others while searching for him. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Earlier tonight, Richard called from his table, you helped a stranger face his fears when you were at your lowest point. If that's not deserving of grace, I don't know what is." Catherine took Marcus's face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "The hospital where I work has an intensive outpatient program. Dr. Roberts has already approved your admission. We can get you the help you needed 4 years ago." Her eyes were fierce with determination. "But you have to choose to accept it. No more running. No more letting shame win." Marcus looked around the restaurant, at his daughter who had grown into a strong, compassionate woman, at Catherine, who had turned their tragedy into a mission of hope, at the Kensingtons, whose chance encounter had orchestrated this moment, at Dr. Roberts, who represented the help he'd been too proud to seek. He thought of the little girl with the hot chocolate, whose simple act of kindness had given him the courage to help Richard. He thought of all the nights he'd slept in doorways, convinced he was protecting his family by staying away, when in reality he'd only been protecting his pride. The restaurant's clock chimed the quarter hour, 15 minutes into the new year. Marcus squared his shoulders and made the hardest and easiest decision of his life. "I choose to stay," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose to get help. I choose to try again." He looked at his family, tears flowing freely now. I choose us. Catherine's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Sarah's grip on his arm tightened. And from the Kensington's table, Eleanor raised her champagne glass in a toast that the entire restaurant joined, to new beginnings. Marcus Thompson, who had started the evening as a homeless man helping a stranger, stood surrounded by love he'd never lost and hope he'd never expected to find again. He had a long road ahead, therapy, recovery, rebuilding trust, but for the first time in 4 years, he wasn't walking that road alone. 1 year later, Marcus stood at the podium in the Kensington Manufacturing Conference Center, adjusting his new tie. The audience before him included faces both familiar and new, employees, social workers, mental health professionals, and most importantly, his family. A year ago today, he began, his voice steadied despite his nerves, I was sleeping in a doorway across from Preston's fine dining. He paused, letting the words sink in. Tonight, I'm standing here as Kensington's Director of IT Security and the founder of Second Chance Tech, our nonprofit program that provides technology training to homeless individuals. In the front row, Catherine beamed with pride. Beside her, Sarah sat with her new fiancé, who she'd met while organizing one of Second Chance Tech's fundraising events. And next to them were Richard and Eleanor Kensington, who had become more than employers, they were family. My story could have ended in that doorway, Marcus continued. Depression had convinced me I was protecting my family by staying away. Pride had convinced me I couldn't ask for help. But something happened that night, a series of small miracles that started with a little girl's hot chocolate. He smiled at the memory. They'd actually found that little girl 3 months ago when her mother recognized Marcus from a newspaper article about Second Chance Tech. She was now one of their most enthusiastic junior volunteers, bringing hot chocolate to every training session. That simple act of kindness gave me the courage to help someone else. And that choice. He looked at Richard, who sat straighter in his chair, no longer afraid of public spaces after months of therapy they'd attended together. That choice changed everything. Marcus touched the 1-year sobriety chip in his pocket, not for alcohol or drugs, but for depression and pride, as his therapist called it. The intensive outpatient program Dr. Roberts had recommended had taught him that mental health was nothing to be ashamed of, and that accepting help was an act of courage, not weakness. In this past year, Second Chance Tech has helped 37 people transition from homelessness to careers in IT. But more importantly, we've helped them reconnect with their families, their self-worth, and their hope. He gestured to several graduates in the audience, each dressed in business attire, their transformations as dramatic as his own. We've learned that rock bottom doesn't have to be an ending. Sometimes it's just the foundation for something extraordinary. Catherine wiped tears from her eyes, recognizing his words from that pivotal night. Their relationship had required work, months of couples therapy, rebuilding trust, learning to communicate differently. But they'd discovered that love, like hope, was more resilient than they'd imagined. Today, we're announcing the expansion of Second Chance Tech to 5 more cities, Marcus revealed, triggering applause. But we're also launching something new. The Eleanor Kensington Mental Health Initiative will ensure that every participant in our program has access to the psychological support they need to truly rebuild their lives. Eleanor gasped softly, they'd kept the name of the initiative secret from her. Her advocacy for mental health awareness, inspired by both her husband's anxiety and Marcus's story, had transformed Kensington Manufacturing's corporate culture. Someone once told me that kindness deserves kindness, Marcus said, nearing his conclusion. I've learned it's more than that. Kindness multiplies. It grows. Every person in this room who helps someone else creates ripples we may never fully see. He looked at Sarah, remembering their tearful conversations about the years they'd lost, and the joy they'd found in building new memories. She'd recently been promoted to general manager at Preston's, where she'd instituted a program providing job training for homeless individuals in the restaurant industry. A year ago, I thought I had nothing left to give. Now I know that even at our lowest, we have something to offer, our experience, our understanding, our willingness to reach out to others who are struggling. His voice grew stronger. Every person has value. Every story matters. And it's never too late for a new beginning. The standing ovation that followed felt like a wave of hope washing through the room. As Marcus stepped down from the podium into the embrace of his family, he caught sight of his reflection in the conference room's window. The man looking back at him was neither the successful IT professional he'd been 5 years ago nor the homeless man from last New Year's Eve. He was someone new, someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Someone who understood that helping others was not just a choice but a calling. Someone who knew that rock bottom could become a foundation, that endings could become beginnings, and that miracles often started with the smallest acts of kindness. As the celebration continued around him, Marcus touched the business card in his pocket, his new one, with both the Kensington Manufacturing and Second Chance Tech logos. Tomorrow, he'd be back on the streets, not as a homeless man, but as a guide, a mentor, and a living testament to the power of hope. The new year was coming again, and this time, he was ready to help write new stories of transformation, one act of kindness at a time.